In this video, I present what I think are the 5 most important things for you to know about the Gospel of Matthew. We'll start at number 5 and work our way down to number 1. Number 5. The Gospel of Matthew identifies Jesus with significant figures in Jewish history. The King James Version of the Bible was published in 1611 amidst much pomp and circumstance. It was, at that time, the best English Bible ever to have been produced. Rumor has it that the famed playwright William Shakespeare had a hand in the translation of the King James Version. Shakespeare was born in the year 1565 and so turned 46 the year the King James Version was published. Some claim that, as a present to himself, Shakespeare wrote, or rather translated, himself into the famed version of the Bible in Psalm 46. If you count 46 words into this psalm from the beginning, you find the word shake. If you count 46 words into the psalm from the end, you'll find the word spear. Shake, spear, Shakespeare. It's actually pretty unlikely that Shakespeare wrote himself into the Bible. I know, it's a bit of a buzzkill. But it's unlikely because he probably didn't have any hand in producing the King James Version. While a literary genius, Shakespeare had very little knowledge of Hebrew or Greek and wasn't a biblical scholar. But we don't need to lose hope entirely. The King James Version was actually not a fresh or a new translation. It was a revision of several different English translations. The translation that was used for Psalm 46 in the King James Version did have shake as its 46th word in from the beginning, but it didn't have spear as the 46th word from its end. 2 small words, namely still and were removed, making spear the 46th word from the end. Perhaps the reviser for Psalm 46, who may have been a fan of Shakespeare, if not Shakespeare himself, put this Easter egg into the text for us. Whatever the case might be, the play with words and numbers is intriguing, and the Gospel of Matthew does something very similar at its beginning. Matthew begins with a human genealogy of Jesus. This is why Matthew's figure is the human. And this serves as a reminder that Jesus is depicted as a human teacher in the gospel and is associated with important figures who are humans from Israel's history throughout the gospel. The genealogy connects Jesus to 42 different humans from Israel's past, but one stands out in particular. Matthew has organized the genealogies by groups of 14. The first set contains 14 individuals. The second set contains another 14 individuals, and the third and final set contains a final 14 individuals. Matthew calls explicit attention to this at the end of the genealogy. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. What might be not so obvious to us as modern Westerner readers of the Bible is that the number 14 likely had symbolic significance for Matthew and for Matthew's audience. In the ancient world, one's name was associated with a number, the number that its letters added up to. If you knew the name, it's easy to figure out the number associated with it. But it's a little bit more difficult to move in the other direction, from the number to the name, because any number could be made up of a variety of different combinations of letters that are associated with numbers. If you wanted to be discreet about referring to someone's name, you might use their number rather than their actual name. So, for example, there are many cases of ancient graffiti that state things like, "I love someone whose number is XYZ." It's nearly impossible for us to know who the numbers 351 and 731 refer to because different names could add up to those numbers. However, someone whose number is 351 or someone whose number is 731 would know that this graffiti is about them because they would know their own numbers. All of this, letters being associated with numbers and adding those numbers up to a sum, is called gematria. It appears that Matthew is using gematria to associate Jesus with another person whose number is 14. And that person appears to be David. In Hebrew, a language that only uses consonants, David's letters are Dalet, Vav, Dalet, the fourth, sixth, and fourth letters in the alphabet, which add up to 14. So, by dividing Jesus' genealogy up into 14s, Matthew has associated Jesus with Israel's most famous king, David. Immediately following the genealogy, Matthew will associate Jesus with another important human figure, Moses. In Matthew, as in the beginning of Exodus, a deranged ruler commits infanticide, and the protagonist, either Jesus in Matthew or Moses in Exodus, miraculously escapes. Matthew then has the young Jesus and the Holy Family going in and out of Egypt in order to stay safe, just as Moses travels in and out of Egypt. Matthew then continues to have Jesus teach in 5 major sections or discourses, which many believe are meant to evoke the 5 books of Torah, which, per tradition, were written by Moses himself. It's very difficult to determine historical information about a text from the text itself when that text is, 1, set in another time period, that is, Matthew is writing of events that occurred some 40 years earlier than when he wrote, and 2, the author says little about themselves, their context, or the time period in which they are writing. Nonetheless, there are a few minor clues in Matthew that might let us piece together when the gospel was written, what the person was like who wrote it, and where they wrote it. Most New Testament scholars think that the very earliest Matthew could have been written is in the early 70s CE. Because Matthew uses Mark extensively, and Mark is usually dated to around 70 CE, people think that Matthew must be dated after 70 CE. And you can see here how dating texts, biblical texts and New Testament texts in particular, begins to be a bit like building a house of cards. The latest that Matthew could have been written was the year 117 CE, when it was quoted by a church father named Ignatius of Antioch in a letter that he wrote. In Matthew 27, verse 8, when locating Judas's place of death, Matthew calls the field of blood, and indicates that even today, that the field is still called by that name, which suggests the passage of a significant amount of time. The field goes by that name because of the events that happened there, even years after those events happened. Our 50-year range for the dating of Matthew is thus 70 to 120 CE, but most scholars push the date back into the 80s CE, assuming Matthew to have been written some 10 to 15 years after Mark was. Matthew's traditionally been associated with the tax collector named Matthew. This was the opinion of the early church leaders as early as the 2nd century CE. Some scholars doubt the association with Matthew the tax collector because of the fact that Matthew uses Mark. Why would an eyewitness and disciple use someone else's material, especially if Mark was not an eyewitness? The gospel itself is strictly speaking anonymous. Only in the title, which is not original to the gospel but added later on, do we have the association with Matthew. Some suggest that if the gospel was really written by the disciple Matthew, he probably would have flashed his credentials somewhere and let the audience know that someone that was close to Jesus, an eyewitness to Jesus, was writing. Even if we can't precisely locate the identity of the author of the Gospel of Matthew, we can gather some information about them from the text itself. This author appears to know Jewish scripture very well. Not only are they playful in associating Jesus with figures that are celebrated in Jewish scripture, but Matthew also cites, quotes, and alludes to scripture very often, much more often than the Gospel of Mark does. Moreover, this writer appears to be an educated and accomplished one. They write well and spend much energy cleaning up some of Mark's oral features, which are judged to be negatively when viewed with a critical and literary eye. The most difficult information to gather is the place where Matthew might have been written and whether or not it was written for an audience in one particular place. It may very well could be the case that Matthew was intended for broad distribution across the then known world. Yet we do have small clues that the author of Matthew may have been associated with urban, prosperous cities. The Gospel of Matthew consistently has Jesus entering and acting in cities rather than in villages, as is the case in the Gospel of Mark. And when Matthew changes Jesus' instructions from Mark 6:8 about the disciples not taking copper coins with them on their travels, Matthew adds silver and gold coins as well. This might suggest that Matthew himself has some wealth, the audience of Matthew has some wealth, or the gospel was written from a location that was prosperous and wealthy. Number 3. The Gospel of Matthew presents itself like Jewish scripture and is best experienced in section. Mark begins by calling itself a gospel, which in the New Testament context primarily meant orally proclaimed news. If we presume that Matthew knew Mark as the two most popular solutions to the synoptic problem, called the two source and far theories, do, then Matthew knew Mark labeled itself a gospel and chose intentionally to label itself differently. Matthew 1:1 describes itself as a book, or biblos in Greek. Here Matthew appears to allude to the beginning of the Gospel of Mark by describing what kind of text it is, just like Mark does, and relating that text to Jesus and stating whose son Jesus is, again, just like Mark does. But Matthew changes Mark's Gospel to a Matthean book and relates Jesus to the human figures of Abraham and David. But Matthew also appears to echo Genesis 2:4 and Genesis 5:1, which claim that the content that follows in Genesis is a book. This associates the Gospel of Matthew directly with an important text of Jewish scripture, Genesis. It's also very significant that the word book in the New Testament most often refers to a specific book of Jewish scripture, whether it be the book of the Psalms, the book of the prophets, the book of the law, or the book of Moses. This is also true of Jewish authors writing around the same time as Matthew that are not recorded in the New Testament. When they use the term book, they usually mean a scriptural book. So what does this mean for the experience of Matthew? In our top 5 on Mark, I claim that Mark was likely experienced orally in single sittings. This is because of the oral style and the length of the Gospel of Mark. Things move quickly as Jesus bounds from location to location, like a lion, performing miraculous and powerful deeds. Matthew doesn't contain the oral style of Mark. It's not as short as Mark, and it doesn't move nearly as quickly as Mark does. Reading the Gospel of Matthew in its entirety in one sitting, whether silently or aloud in a group, is a bit of a slog. It takes about 3.5 to 4 hours compared to Mark's 1.5 to 2 hours. This is probably because Matthew was not meant to be experienced orally in one sitting like Mark was. Like Jewish scripture of the Old Testament, which was typically read piecemeal and taught and discussed in synagogue setting, the Gospel of Matthew associates itself with Jewish scripture at its beginning with the word book, and then contains 5 major teaching sections, and this makes them best experienced section by section. Number 2, the Gospel of Matthew exhibits a unique and intensified hostility toward Jewish leaders. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisees were on the rise. They were perhaps the most prominent Jewish sect after 70 CE, and they were the predecessors to the rabbis and rabbinic Judaism, which itself is a forerunner to much modern Jewish thought. One reason for the rise of the Pharisees is that Jews of the period were attempting to make sense of their religious life after one of its central institutions no longer existed. Sacrifice and worship at the temple could no longer be a focal point for Jewish religious life. The reading, interpretation, and teaching of Scripture, and especially of the law, stepped in to fill the void left by the temple's absence. It's in this context that Matthew's writing and also placing Jesus, even if somewhat anachronistically. The gospel comes from a context when Jewish sects are emerging and clarifying their new distinctive beliefs and practices. Matthew and Matthew's audience had both similarities to and differences from these emerging sects of Judaism, and particularly the Pharisees, who came to be understood as the Jewish leaders and interpreters of the law par excellence. Matthew is often called the most Jewish gospel, and it's sometimes claimed that Matthew's author was a Jewish Christian. Matthew embeds its disagreements with and antagonism towards Jewish sects and Jewish leaderships within the gospel itself. In Matthew, Jesus calls Jewish leaders evil, a brood of vipers, children of hell, and identifies them as in relationship with Satan. Because of these statements, the Gospel of Matthew, more than any other gospel, has been used to anti-Semitic ends. It's important to remember that Jesus' words in Matthew's context is one in which there is much inner Jewish conflict. We shouldn't imagine Matthew's words as those held up against another religion altogether. Rather, Matthew's words are against a group to which Matthew and Matthew's audience is in close social and religious proximity. We often have the most intense conflict with those whom we are closest to. Christian use of Matthew's words for anti-Semitic ends is both morally reprehensible and historically irresponsible. And number 1. The Gospel of Matthew uses literary material from the Gospel of Mark extensively and improves upon it stylistically. The Synoptic Gospels consist of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All three share significant overlap with one another. The material shared between all three, that is, the episodes that occur in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is called the triple tradition. There's also material shared between just Matthew and Luke, which is called the double tradition. This material, the double tradition material, is usually explained either as coming from a source in addition to Mark, called Q, under the two-source theory, or from Luke using Matthew directly, under the Farrer theory. When it comes to the triple tradition, we find that 90% of Mark is carried over to Matthew. That is, 90% of the episodes that appear in Mark also appear in Matthew. Matthew has taken them over from the predecessor, Mark. But Matthew doesn't simply take these words over unedited. Not only does Matthew add material to Mark in the form of new episodes about Jesus and new teachings from him, but Matthew also improves on what is often called Mark's oral style. Matthew curbs Mark's overuse of the word and, which is called paratactic structuring. Matthew uses a much fuller range of conjunctions to connect its sentences, but, then, however, and so on and so forth. Matthew also changes Mark's sense of urgency, that fast-moving nature of the gospel. One of Mark's favorite words is immediately, which Matthew almost always removes, making the gospel slow down quite a bit. Matthew is also much more precise and exact in the way it recalls texts from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. What all this indicates is that Matthew has used Mark extensively, but aims to alter it for a different mode of reception. Whereas Mark's style is well suited for oral proclamation and performance, Matthew's style is well suited for being read, taught, and discussed by individuals and communities.